October 28th, the Carter Center announced that they would be observers to the Mvskoke Creek Nation primary and general elections. Mvskoke Media interviewed Brett Lacy about what the process entails and what the Carter Center's goals are for the observation.
So I just wanted to start out maybe giving folks a broad idea of the Carter Center and what it does. Can you just start there? It's in reference to electoral process anyway.
Sure. So we're a nonprofit organization, a non-governmental organization founded by former President Jimmy Carter and his wife, where our headquarters is in Atlanta, Georgia. And within our democracy program, our primary activity has been conducting what we call international election observation missions around the world. We've done 110-ish, I think, of them to date in the history of the Carter Center. This might be 110. I can confirm that for you. But so, and our role in those activities is to provide support to electoral processes. In the beginning, we were observing elections in places that were coming out of conflict or countries that are having maybe their first election at the end of a civil war, these kinds of really difficult contexts. But we've advocated from the beginning that it's important that every election should have election observation. Our role is to provide some transparency to the process, to help lend some credibility to the process where it's warranted, to help the people really have access to a credible source of information about what is and isn't happening during an electoral process. Okay. And so that's what we try to do.
You said that you're a nonprofit. Can you talk about how you're funded a little bit?
Sure. So we're funded in a range of ways, sometimes by private contributions but most of our projects around the world are funded by bilateral agreements but we're a nonprofit, so we get grants just like all other nonprofit organizations. So we write proposals and when we're successful, we get grants. Often those come from governments, usually foreign governments, to support our work abroad. The United Kingdom, Canada, Sweden, Norway, sometimes the United States support a lot of our work. This effort is supported by institutional funds of the Carter Center.
And you talk about observation of elections. Can you talk a little bit about that process for us?
Sure. So typically we like to recruit our observers come internationally, because although our headquarters is in the United States and the head of our organization is a former American president, we consider ourselves an international organization. So we recruit observers globally from Africa, Latin America, Asia, to try to have some truly diverse teams that bring a range of perspectives to our process. So we recruit those observers, we train them up on the polling procedures or specific elements of a particular electoral process, and then we deploy them out on election day to collect data about what's happening on election day.
Okay. I was reading on the website that there's observation and then there's some more intensive involvement with the elections. Can you speak to the difference between those levels of involvement?
Sure. So in a perfect world, we would do what we call long-term observation, and that involves it coming out much earlier in an electoral process. 'Cause in general, an election, by the time you get to election day, it's too late. There's so much about an election that happens so far in advance. So when we have access to adequate resources, we like to have observers on the ground much earlier to observe any kind of like the candidate nomination period, any kind of voter registration activity that might be happening, training of poll workers, those kinds of electoral preparations we like to be around for.
Okay, when you talk about that early involvement versus what's going to take place this weekend, can you kind of point out like what you will be able to do this weekend, since you didn't have that early access, really?
Sure.
What will be the scope of your observations this weekend?
Great question. So we have a small team here, and our delegation arrived a couple of days ago. So essentially, we'll be able to comment on what we can observe. We're not here to comment on things that happened before. We're not, like, for example, we're not here to comment on the election that took place in September or the dispute resolution process around that election. where we can't really look backwards, but we will be able to comment on some of the early voting procedures. We'll be able to comment on some of the polling and counting procedures, some of the procedures around the absentee ballots for this election, as well as the broader legal framework for the elections. We've read through the electoral code, and we've taken a look at your constitution and some of the other kind of broader frameworks for this democracy that we'll be able to comment on as well.
Okay, wonderful. When we talk about the different folks that you guys go out and help and observe elections for, can you tell us a little bit about those candidates and like who it typically is again? I know you mentioned it a little bit early on, where you spend the bulk of your time.
Sure. So we work internationally, and we require that we be invited to observe an election. We don't want to insert ourselves, and we don't want to go anywhere where we're not welcome. So we only go to countries where we're invited and where we're welcome by the government and by the electoral authorities, but also by other candidates in a process. It really ranges. Sometimes I think we say that we do maybe 3 to 5 elections a year these days, and we try to make sure that we're selecting countries and nations and elections where there seems to be a genuine interest in our presence and where we feel that we can make some recommendations that might have an impact, or where there seems to be a genuine interest in being responsive maybe to election observers, or where we feel that the level of transparency that we provide might make an impact on the process. Okay.
You talked about one of the criteria for coming to an election being that you're welcome and invited. Is there any other criteria surrounding an election that you would be looking for before you guys commit to coming?
Sure. So in some cases we do what we call a pre-election assessment, where we would go out to assess whether or not it's an election that we think would be a good fit or make sense for the kind of observation that we do. But one of our criteria would be to make sure that, from the beginning, that it's an election that has the potential to be a credible election and that offers people a genuine choice. We don't want to observe an election that from the beginning it's clear that there's a problem, or that it's really not offering maybe citizens a genuine choice, or that, before we've gotten there, that's already too problematic for us to have an impact on the credibility of an election. So that's one of our bigger criteria.
When you guys begin observing, say tomorrow, can you give us an idea of what you'll be observing and what does that process look like?
Sure. So we're up early and we get to the polls before they open. And a part of our purpose is to look and see how polling procedures are being implemented, to assess the extent to which they're being implemented in a standard way across the nation. We observe the process of the opening of polling stations, or the polling precincts. We observe the voting process throughout the day. And then we also observe the closing of the polling processes and any transfer of sensitive materials like ballots. Okay.
So if the Mvskoke Creek Nation was looking for help beyond observation, what would that timeline look like that more intensive observation? You mentioned how long in advance?
Yeah, great question. So that can really vary, I think, on the needs of a nation. But one of the longer term things that we do relates to election reform in cases where after we've observed an election and we issue a report and people are saying, now what? Great, thanks for making these recommendations, but how do we implement them? Or when you say make improvements on the secrecy of the vote, exactly what you mean. So, sometimes people invite us to come back to put some more meat on the bones, really, or to maybe help provide advice to an election reform process, or to provide some advice in the period between elections on maybe updates to electoral procedures or strengthening practices within an election commission or an election board. Those are kinds of things that we do in periods between elections, and that time frame really depends on the need of the nation, really.
Okay. When you mentioned the report, how long does it typically take you guys to formulate that report? What is the reporting process in terms of where will the report be delivered, who gets to see it, kind of thing?
Right. So our reports are public, and we make them public. We feel that we're here observing a sovereign process. We're here observing an election, and that our observations and findings should be available to the people of that nation. So all of our reporting is intended to be public. And we do that in different kinds of ways. Sometimes we do, especially when we're on the ground a little bit longer, sometimes we do release reports in advance of an election. We might do a pre-election statement that would have summarized kind of our observations of a campaign period or voter registration period or something like that. But we often, if not a report, we at least often like to make some comments to the media, like yourselves, in the days after an election to share kind of our more immediate observations and findings. And then there's usually a more comprehensive final report that includes an analysis of the legal framework and other things. And that usually comes out within a few months.
Okay. Can you give us any idea, and this might just be a little broad, but is there like a standard kind of best practices that you guys really shoot for? If you were to, as you said, you have some instances where you coach along when you come back, or if you're asked to help with the meat on the bones. What are some of those standard best practices that you look for?
Yes. So we have spent on the last few decades really working at the international level and with members of the United Nations to develop standards for democratic elections. So we have a handbook on it that I can provide to you. But so we've developed this this handbook. We call it Democratic Election Standards that outline some of those things, and a lot of it is it's big picture things that are found in international human rights treaties, which most nations are signatories to. Things like secrecy of the vote, or ensuring that men and women have equal access to an electoral process. Those kinds of things we look at and try to make sure that they're reflected in an electoral law.
I'm sorry.
No problem.
It's been going off today. I think
I'm sure
that's
you must be very busy.
It has been a little bit busy. I think that's about all of my major questions. Do you guys have anything you'd like to add? Anything I might have missed that you think would be important for our viewers and our readers to know about this trip down and what you're doing this weekend? And
I guess maybe the only other thing I would add is I think this is the fourth election that we've done for a Native American tribe. And honestly, we're honored to be invited, and we're happy to be here, and it's something that we hope that we can start to do more of. The Carter Center doesn't work in the United States because President Carter is a former head of state, and so we don't work in the United States, and we don't work on elections in the United States. But we're very happy to be invited to observe these sovereign elections that are happening here, and it's something that we hope we can do more of in the future.
okay, wonderful.